Christopher, what about making the documentary Tiny helped you become a better filmmaker? What did you learn from that experience?
Wow, so much. Tiny was definitely for me a boot camp and really in filmmaking, but also particularly making documentaries. From everything from the actual process of shooting and editing and doing sound and those things, but also from the business side of things in terms of raising money and distribution and the film festival circuit and learning about festival strategy all the way through running your own business. So I mean, I learned so many things. It's you know, I can't even. We don't have enough time to go over it, really.
Well, you had said earlier off camera that the design community is a very enthusiastic
Mm-hmm.
community, and then it's a large group, I think. Did you think that they would take to the film as they did? I mean, it's one of our most watched videos from when we interviewed you. So, did you think that they would just be so taken by it?
When we first, set out to do Tiny, Moret and I, we didn't really know what to expect, and it certainly exceeded any sort of expectation that we had for the project initially. But we, along the way, saw how people were reacting to it. So when the first time it kind of went public as a project was when we did Kickstarter, and seeing how that took off, and how before we even finished the movie, we had something like 700 or 800 Facebook followers for it, and we could tell that there was something there, and the interest in the media all along, and just the way that things would get, would be shared or go viral or things like that. And it got to the point where we would talk to a new reporter or whoever, and we'd say, just so you know, a lot of people are going to read your article or whatever, and they'd be like, oh yeah, of course, everybody always says that. Sure. And then we get an email like a week to the day later, and like, this was like the most read article that we'd ever had, and I'm like, I told you, I'd like to pretend that was because Moret and I were very charming and they really cared about our story, but in reality, I think that we just really timed it well, and that the tiny house phenomenon, it was basically as if there was just a whole bunch of dried hay and somebody lit a match, and we just happened to really time it perfectly, and that and the interest in that kind of design in particular and simple living was at just the right place. But I have since learned, through that process that, having communities that are interested in the topic of your film as a documentary filmmaker is really helpful, and particularly because communities are, it's basically, what do they call, like a lateral community, where it's a bunch of people who choose to associate because of something that they share, like an interest, rather than like a geographic location, and those communities can really propel your projects forward.
Right, and I know Jay Schaefer had been around for a long time with Tumbleweed.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's his
name.
Yeah,
although he now has his own company called Four Lights Tiny House Company.
Oh, okay, yeah. So then, from what you learned in terms of looking back, what would you not repeat in terms of maybe a planning perspective, technical, even getting it into film festivals? What were some things that you plan to do differently with? I know you have many projects you want to be involved in, so what did it teach you in that sense?
I think, honestly, this, not to sound, I guess slightly arrogant or whatever, but we actually didn't really make that many mistakes, which we very easily could have. But we were we had a lot of good mentors who kind of steered us in the right direction. I would say that I think some of the bigger mistakes though were, and I don't know if this is necessarily a mistake, but we set out to make a short film. And so when we decided to make a longer film, there were some things that we didn't film in the beginning that I would have with going into it with that knowledge. And so when we tried to make a feature, like a longer feature, 80 minutes long or whatever, we realized that the material we had couldn't really make a compelling narrative of that length. And so we ended up scaling it back to 62 minutes, which ended up being the right fit for the movie, and it worked great. However, in terms of distribution, no one is going to distribute a film less than 74-ish minutes. So it really automatically ruled out any sort of all rights deals that we might have had with some of the bigger doc distributors who initially were interested but ultimately didn't do it because they couldn't do a theatrical release.
Well, that leads me to my next and also last question about Tiny, and just that is that, did you receive millions of views on like Netflix and Hulu and iTunes? And how were you able to verify that?
Right. So you can't. They won't tell you. In terms of SVOD, subscription video on demand, they won't tell you how many views you have. But I can say that I've sort of pieced together that I would guess if I were estimating anywhere from 5 to maybe as much as 30 million views on Netflix alone. And the way that I came to that assessment, and that's still a wide range, so obviously I don't know that much, but back before Netflix changed their layout, they used to have the star ratings, and underneath the star ratings, it would tell you how many people gave it a star rating. And I think when ours went, right when they remodeled, the last time I had looked, it was like 560,000 star ratings, which, is for documentaries actually is like really high. Most we're having around 50,000. And if you can assume, and I don't really know what the real number is, but I imagine only maybe 1 out of 10 people actually take the trouble to rate a movie. So 10 times that would be 5 million, but it could be as high as 20. We don't really know. Since then, I had a meeting at Netflix, and I tried to ask them. I was like, "Do you know how many views we?" And of course, the person I was talking with was like, "Yeah, I can't tell you that, but I can tell you that it had a lot more than my friend's movie, and hers, and she had a lot, or something. I don't know, something like that." And I was like, "Okay, so that's as close as I'm going to get to an answer." But it was a lot, and even like one time we actually found a pirated copy of Tiny on YouTube, and it had something like 70,000 views. And
oh wow!
I was like, well, if the pirated YouTube version has 70,000, then we can assume that the non-pirated version, had more. So I think it's still on Hulu, and I had a friend who worked at Hulu who also said that it was doing pretty well, but I don't know. And it didn't come out on Hulu until like 2 years or maybe like a year and a half after it was on Netflix. So I don't really know what the numbers are, but I assume that if you included all of the views everywhere, it would probably be in the tens of millions.
Currency is your new project. It's a Kickstarter campaign that has, I think at this point, 6 days left. What is it about, and how did you find out about the subject matter?
Well, I think Christopher, you can start.
Okay. Yeah. So Currency is an environmental thriller, and it takes place in Cambodia, and it really explores the illegal fishing trade and also the corruption that kind of enables it to keep going. As most people are familiar with, Cambodia had a really horrible genocide, 30 or 40 years ago. And in our movie, we didn't want to really touch on that much, but it really does sort of set the climate for what's going on there. Ever since that happened, the genocide, wiped out a whole culture of academia and almost a whole generation of people. So now what you see is the people who kind of came into power and filled that vacuum, the power vacuum, have been running the country for a long time. And the country is become really corrupt and kind of run on this informal economy. And it's also undergoing rapid development now because the development had been so depressed for so long. And those two things together have created this environment where lots of resource exploitation has been happening, and the proceeds of that have not gone to the country but to individual members of the government and sort of rich people in the community who have relationships with the government. So in how that played out in the oceans is that Cambodia is traditionally an agricultural economy, and on the coastline that means fishing and a lot of subsistence and small scale fishing. But over the last 10 years or so, there's been an increase in trawling activity, and I can go over what trawling is in a minute, and also a lot of bigger boats coming in from neighboring countries like Thailand and Vietnam have started competing with the local fishermen on a more industrial scale, which then in turn forces some of the local fishermen to increase their ways of fishing, oftentimes through really destructive fishing techniques that are outlawed in most other countries and even are outlawed in Cambodia. Those laws just aren't enforced. So it's become this sort of arms race of destructive and illegal fishing practices in this part of the ocean. And in order to get away with it, they basically pay off those corrupt local officials who pocket the money and then choose not to enforce the laws. That is the background of the issue. But what our film follows in particular is an investigative journalist who has been writing about these issues for the last 3 or 4 years in Cambodia, or actually 4 or 5 years at this point. And then our other main character is a conservationist who's trying to create a marine fisheries protected area. And in that process, patrols it and kind of confronts a lot of these fishermen, which often turns into serious confrontations and conflicts. And sometimes they're violent, sometimes they're dangerous for him and his crew, and they cause a lot of I guess turmoil for his project. Would you say it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the two main characters, but we also follow some local people. There are actually 4 young Cambodian university students who are actually, as far as we're aware, some of the first in their country, particularly in their age, that are actively pursuing careers in marine conservation. And we follow the 2 female students in their group, and they were staying with Paul on the island to do their thesis project, and they're doing it on creating a small artificial reef and monitoring that, which what they'll learn there, Paul and his crew are scaling up now that they've been approved for their larger marine fisheries protected area. They're going to use that same process to demarcate the boundary of the area and kind of put in these snags for the trawling nets. But they also create habitat for local wildlife. So.
And which one of you came on first? Stephanie, did you hear about the project first, or was it Christopher?
Well, I've been working in Cambodia for probably, the past 3 or 4 years. I started interning out there. I had an internship in human rights, and I was working at an NGO that was monitoring the Khmer Rouge tribunals. And I kept going back there to work on another documentary of mine, and I became friends with Christopher a couple years later. And Christopher learned about this guy, this vigilante environmental activist, Paul Ferber, who was fighting illegal fishing in the Gulf of Thailand and Cambodia. And he told me about it, and we just decided that we both had to make a documentary about this work and everything that was happening there.
Yeah, I think it was a natural pairing because Stephanie has got a lot of great producing skills, which I lack organizational skills tremendously. But also, yeah, I'd never been to Asia at all, and she spent a lot of time over there. So as soon as I heard about it, I'm like, I know the perfect person to approach about working on this together. So she's been indispensable. I honestly don't know if I could have or would have done it without her. So.
Well, yeah, and the film wouldn't be what it is without Christopher. It's been his filmmaking has been absolutely superb and very impressive. It's over the past year that we've been working on this. It's a lot of run and gun out there, and Cambodia is difficult to shoot in. It's usually 90% humidity and at least 100 degrees, and especially on the island that Paul lives on. And but things have really evolved naturally from us working together to working with Paul and meeting and Matt and having him be part of our story too, and all of the other Cambodian characters that we've been working with. It's been a really natural evolution.
Right. Yeah, the Kickstarter video is phenomenal. So we'll put a link underneath this video for people to look at. So was Paul, the first person that you contacted, or how did that transpire?
Yeah, I think you reached out to Paul.
Yeah, I guess when I heard about Paul, I went to he has an organization that he started called Marine Conservation Cambodia, and I went to their website and sent an email, I think, to the general information email, and we actually heard back from this woman, Charlie, who is a photographer and was, basically found out about Paul and kind of just was volunteering her time to help coordinate, because on their small island, they don't actually, well, at least at the time, didn't have good or any really cell phone or internet access. So Charlie would respond to their communications, and then she eventually set up a call that we had with Paul late one night.
Yeah.
And
it's like a 15-hour time difference, I think.
Yeah. And they were, I think that we got them at the right time. They were having, trying to figure out how to do some fundraising, and I think that they thought that, having some more exposure in the media would help them with that. So Stephanie actually had already planned a trip out there 3 weeks from that conversation, and that was right around the same time that I was thinking would be good to go. And so we ended up, I ended up buying a ticket because she already had one, and then we went together and we worked for about 10 days on this project, and then maybe 3 or 4 on some other projects that Stephanie had. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what type of an email are you sending to someone? Because you know that this is like, this could make or break whether they respond to you. Is this a long email, short email? How are you wording it?
yeah, so access is in documentaries, access is probably 25% of what makes a successful project, maybe even as high as 30 or 40. Luckily, after doing Tiny, I think that being able to say that I had a film on Netflix, and it's funny that Netflix is the catchword these days, but yeah, saying that I had a film on Netflix has opened up a lot of doors in that regard, and people take you more seriously. So that's really fortunate that I can do that. So basically, my email would look like a little bit about my background, how we found out about them, and just like, let's talk more. Not really, because we also don't really know when we reach out to people what we want to do necessarily with them. Because you kind of hear what might be a good story, but you don't really know until you kind of get there and you see what's going on. In fact, when we started this, we also thought it was going to be a short film. And then once we got there, we met Matt, who became our primary character, really. And we realized that the context of everything going on there enhanced Paul's story. But there were other stories, and it was all part of a larger story of what's happening in the region. And then that's when we thought we could make a feature. So we just, you got to keep things fluid and open in the early days. And so we kind of just have a very broad idea when we contact people that we want to do something, we think, but we're not sure what.
Yeah, and I think something important too when reaching out to possible characters in a documentary, if you're not sure, is just making sure that they feel safe in the email, and making sure that you've researched. It's really important to give the impression that you've researched them and that you know what you're talking about, because just telling them that you want to reach out to them or that you want to talk to them about a film usually isn't enough, especially if people have been kind of burned by media, or haven't always been portrayed in the best light, or are unsure of what kind of context something is going to be shown in. So it's really important to make the people feel safe so that they can at least have an initial conversation with you.
And not to correct you, but I would say that even rather than making feel like you've done the research, it's actually doing the research.
Doing the research,
which is what I think. No, but
yeah. I mean, you have to do the research. You have to know what you're talking about in the email. As brief as it is in the beginning, and you have to, just show your stuff a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that this is probably a larger question, but actually approaching with good intentions, people can tell that, from your first phone call, and I think. It's important to do, particularly documentaries. I think it's particularly to do for the right reasons, and being honest and straightforward and transparent. And that bleeds into your whole relationship with your subject, which is honestly, we could have a whole conversation about that and how tricky it can be to maintain a good working relationship. I mean, not even working relationship, just a relationship with the subjects of your film, because it's fraught with all sorts of potential pitfalls and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
In the Kickstarter video, Christopher, you talked about how you'd like to make Current Sea different from other environmental documentaries, and that sometimes they seem more sort of like science, like it's more of a academic, video or something. How do you propose doing that with Current Sea? How will it be a little bit different without giving away too much about the film?
So what drew me to Current Sea as a film, in particular as a filmmaker, is that I thought it was a very exciting story. There's a lot of inherent conflict, over these resources. And even though the sort of setting and what's at stake and all of that is definitely environmental in its nature, and it has to do with protecting the environment, at the heart of it is really a human drama. And there's a lot of different aspects to that drama too. There's, poverty and people trying to get by, but there's also politics and government and corruption, and there's also, you know, more broader themes like, you know, greed and love and kindness and all these things. And so, I mean, I just thought that was an amazing framework, you know, to address a social issue. And also, this kind of came about not too long after Cartel Land was around, and it really struck me as when I saw Cartel Land, I thought, you know, and I think there are some, you know, fair criticisms of that movie, so I'm not trying to sell it as like the best thing ever, but it really, it's a great movie. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. In fact, that I felt inspired to make a sort of a similar film with a similar vibe to it. And I thought that, but I wanted to do an environmental one, and I just thought this had all the pieces for that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that that's kind of what I mean. It's not by no means not the first environmental film that's like a thriller. I think The Cove and Racing Extinction, which I was involved with, also have elements of that. Although I think that those are less gritty than what Currency is gonna be in the end. But then there's also another filmmaker. I'm forgetting his name right now, but he did Marmato, and he just had another one that premiered at Tribeca called A River Below, and I think that he does similar kinds of things. So I don't want to claim like this is totally unique in its tone or vibe. However, I do think that we need to find a way to connect with people on the environment that is more than just your typical science lesson about, you know, climate change. And, you know, I think you see a lot of environmental filmmakers doing this right now with, you know, Jeff Orlowski with Chasing Coral. It's like he is talking about coral bleaching, but really he's following, you know, these scientists and photographers who are trying to capture it visually. So the story there is really the like people. And so you really got to find that human story at the center of the environmental issue. And I thought that just this one was, you know, a very exciting one that's going to hook people. So,
Well, it sounds like you have 4 stories in a sense. You have the journalist, and then you have the environmental gentleman, and then the 2 students. So do they all sort of come together in that, or is it more focused on one of the 2 men?
Okay. Let's talk about Matt. Yeah.
Okay. So basically, we met them all through connections from each other, really. So their stories intersect and they weave together, and it really, I think all of their stories and stories of many other people there are part of the same story. We do focus a little bit more on the journalist, Matt, and then also on Paul, who is on the island and starting the Marine Fisheries Protected Area. And the students, we met on Paul's Island, so they're kind of part of that story too. But yeah, I mean, I do think that it's not really like 4 intertwining stories as it is one story where we have different characters that come along in the journey and show up at different times and stuff like that. So.
How is that for them to, did you speak to all of them beforehand and letting them know, like, look, there may be parts of the film where you won't necessarily like how you're portrayed? I mean, that's always for any documentary that you're doing, or it doesn't seem like that's come up yet, because people are so, they only want to be seen the way they see themselves, and sometimes the camera shows a better angle, a worse angle, neutral, so, you know, it's a fine line. And how is that?
Well, that's one of the things that's really important, like in addition to the initial email and the initial access, getting, I guess, creating a good relationship with the people in your film. It all comes down to making sure that everyone feels comfortable and that they trust you. It all comes down to trust. So if they know that they can trust you to make sure that their, image or that whatever they're doing is going to be portrayed, in the way that the documentary should portray it, then that's how you can really make a great film. And I think that, that's a risk that they're taking, by being part of any film, or that any character is taking by being part of a documentary. And that's the only way to really do it. They have to trust the documentary filmmakers, because if a character in a film has a lot of oversight or has the right to screen everything before it gets out there, it really affects how ethical we can be as filmmakers and as storytellers.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think every situation is different too, and every relationship is different with your subjects, just like they are with any relationship in your life. And I think that you are faced as a filmmaker with some difficult choices in that regard. I've been, when I go out to Cambodia, so the first time Stephanie and I went together, but the last 2 times that we filmed down there, it was just me because Stephanie's been working on her on a Netflix series. But when when I'm out there, I have shown, I've shared with them like the trailer. We cut like a sizzle trailer. I showed that to them because, it's interesting. It's, the risk is they might not like what they see and then shut down and, close off access. But the flip side of that is they might really like what you see and then open access and or at least trust you more. And but I kind of made that choice to share what we had at the time, just because I thought that I wanted to be transparent and keep them excited, because filmmaking is a long, particularly documentary filmmaking, is a long process. And I've been out there a few times, been filming them for a year, and if they don't feel like progress is being made, or they start to wonder what you do, that can also kind of erode your relationship. So it's always constantly a bit of a balance. And I don't like to hide things, but I also don't necessarily, like Stephanie said, I don't necessarily think it's also helpful to show people early versions of things, because it's a half-formed idea, not a fully formed thought or whatever. And so it doesn't even really represent necessarily what the end thing is going to be. And I learned that on Tiny, actually, when we screened some work in progress screenings at film festivals. We did it twice, and I regret doing that, only because people see the first thing and then in their mind that's what the film is always, and you never really get a second chance for a first impression. So yeah, I guess that's just to say it's complicated, and I think it's case by case.
In the Kickstarter video, you have a image of a man fighting off another man on a boat, or there's a fight that takes place. So we see that it's a turbulent environment, some of the filming that you've been exposed to. Are you worried about your own personal safety?
I'm worried about Christopher's safety all the time when he's out there and I'm not there.
Really? You never told me that. Well, my mom is. I know that much. And now Stephanie. It's filming in Cambodia in particular. I'll just speak for that, because it's probably different in different countries, but you kind of get a pass a bit for being a Westerner. And you have a certain degree of protection that locals don't have. And so a lot of journalists who are Cambodian and a lot of environmentalists who are Cambodian are either imprisoned or sometimes disappeared, or there are some prominent cases of very public killings that, of course, never really get solved or get tied to anybody. So it's a lot more dangerous for them than it is for people like us going in. However, when you're out on the open oceans, a lot of things can accidentally happen. And actually, we, in the course of making this film, learned about a local Cambodian Cham fisherman who was killed by a Vietnamese fisherman. And of course, that also, nobody was held responsible for that. And so there is a certain amount of danger for sure. And particularly on these boats, they're really small. And, it's there's not a lot of places to run and hide. You can't just run away. It's like you're stuck there. So there was a few moments, which isn't in the Kickstarter video and might not even be in the film, but where we were out on patrol. That's what MCC calls it when they go looking for illegal fishermen. It's called a patrol. Not that they necessarily go looking, but when they kind of come in their area, they'll kind of go out to try to stop them. They take the nets. And so when we do some of those things, they're usually at night, because that's when the illegal fishermen are operating. And they operate without lights. So you go out there, it's pitch black. And Stephanie, when we went out the first time, we had an encounter. So then what happens is they'll like kind of creep up on the illegal fishermen, and then they turn on their lights and start shining lights on them. But then the fishermen have brighter lights that they shine back on you, and they usually fish in groups. And so what they do is they drop their nets and they start encircling you, and there's lots of yelling in Khmer, which is the language in Cambodia. And it's actually really kind of scary. It might not come off that way on the video, but in the moment, it's like, anything can happen. And one time when I was there the second time, we went out and we didn't have the advantage. It was like a new moon, so there was no light basically. And you could barely make out some shapes. And all of a sudden we realized that we were pretty much surrounded by 4 or 5 giant, actually I think it might've been as much as 7 giant Vietnamese paratrawlers. And you can hear on the radio, and then, their lights start coming on when they see, and everybody knows who Paul is and what they do. So they're on the lookout for Paul, and that's why they travel in groups, because then they can kind of like combat them better. So anyways, at that point they kind of surrounded us, and we actually kind of moved away because we were worried about getting too far away from, they have a medium-sized boat, a speedboat, and a big boat. And if we were too far away from reinforcements in the big boat, then it could be like an issue. So we but nothing ended up happening that night. But there's moments where yeah, like when it feels in control, like it's not as scary. But the moment when you feel like, oh, this has now gotten out of control, that's when your little warning bells go off. Having said that, nothing's happened so far, and I think that legally speaking, like in getting in trouble with the government, there's some risk there in terms of they could just kind of decide that they don't want to tolerate us anymore, and not so much. I don't think they would necessarily arrest us, but they could definitely kick us out of the country and say we can't come back, and then we wouldn't be able to finish our movie. So there's a little bit of fear of that too, which is, I think is a little unfair in a way. Just not unfair, but I think that, we are trying to do with our movie what's best for Cambodia. Obviously as we see it, but which is shed light on this sort of issue, because a lot of these illegal fishermen are really, what they're doing is, besides just destroying the environment, which as Westerners is probably like what we're initially drawn to, but in terms of the people in the country, there's a lot of people who live off of the ocean and subsistence fishing who are having harder and harder time being able to do that because the fish are disappearing, the habitat for the fish is disappearing. They'll put their crab pots in or their own smaller nets that just get taken up by the big fishing boats, and they lose their livelihood. And they also get into skirmishes with these larger illegal fishermen. And so there is people there who kind of need this to happen for them. Not necessarily the movie, but like the work that Paul and Matt are doing. And so getting that out there to the larger audience, I think, is going to be very helpful. And I would hope that the government would understand that that's what we're trying to do, and we're not there to like make them look bad, but to try to like sort of correct some injustices, perhaps.
Yeah, and
the mail's here.
Stephanie, did you have any scary encounters when you were in Cambodia?
Well, shooting in Cambodia is always a little bit scary because things just are a little bit more dangerous there in general. But on our first shoot out there, we were just at the island with Paul, and Matt was there, and it was getting late in the night, and Paul had been looking to see if there were trawlers around, and there weren't any. And then all of a sudden, he hears one coming in. He can hear the engine from like miles away, and everyone gets their stuff together, and we get on one of his boats, and then we start going out. It's the middle of the night. There's not much light out at all, and then we go to one place, and one boat is fine. They were fine, and then we go to another. They try to go to another boat, and they realize it's bigger, or something like that. And so then Paul stops by one of his other boats. So he has a medium boat at this time. And then there's a bigger boat that they want to take for like reinforcement. So he stops by there, and then it's just insanity. It's so total chaos, just on these like little wooden boats, just running around everywhere. And I jump into the bigger boat because I think that it's going to go. We first imagined that it was going to go with them, only to realize that I became completely separated by Christopher. I could still hear a little bit of what's going on this, like on one of our mic things, and on one of our recorders, but I couldn't hear everything, and I kept expecting my boat to meet up with them. And so I lost Christopher for several hours. I had no idea what was going on. I was totally terrified. I could only hear a little bit of static coming in and out. And then like finally when we find them, because they were just like out in the middle of the water, and the person on my boat couldn't find them. Finally, when we find them, they were side by side, this other trawler filled with like illegal fishermen, and Christopher's just there shooting. And like we're just screaming. It was just terrifying. And
that was a fun night. And also we had 2 wireless lavaliers, and she had a recorder, and she was recording one of them, and I was recording another one attached to the camera. But the problem is that she had the receiver for the person that I was in the boat with, and then I had the receiver for the person she was in the boat with. So we ended up getting out of range, and then kind of not entirely messing up our audio, but it certainly didn't help anything. But it was just funny because like it's things you don't anticipate like that come up all the time, and
yeah,
you know.
Yeah. And then I'm just like sitting on a boat that's going nowhere for a couple hours while Christopher is out, like maybe dead. I have no idea. Maybe kidnapped. Who knows? Maybe he's in Vietnam and no one will know. And I'm just hanging out.
So during that, at this point, what are you thinking about the documentary, or you know, or the trip that you've taken? Is it?
I'm just hoping he's getting good footage.
Okay.
That makes 2 of us. Yeah.
Which segues into another issue, and that is when you get something that maybe needs to be ramped up a little bit. Maybe not every experience is going to be.
Can I add something to the last
sure.
question?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't mean to interrupt.
No. Let's. Yeah.
One thing I'd like to point out though is that, you know, it's easy to sit here in our house in LA and talk about the danger we had out there, but these people do this every day, and you know, Paul and his family who live on the island, they have to commute to the mainland, and just, you know, not too long ago, his family was coming back from the mainland and Paul wasn't on the boat, and they got surrounded by a whole fleet of electric trawlers, and they were throwing things at him, and it actually hurt his wife. And had they caught him, there's no telling what they could have or would have done to them. And so this is like a current, like a continuous threat that Paul deals with, but also just other fishermen and other Cambodians in the area. So this is like, you know, so when I was down there and, you know, you're seeing these things happen, and it's you know, it's a bit of privilege to say, I don't want to participate in this, you know? So I figured it's sort of my responsibility to like make sure to film it. And as Matt in our film, the original conflict you cited that you see a little bit of in the Kickstarter video, when we were filming that, you know, I interviewed Matt afterwards, and he was basically like, you know, part of me wanted to run to the back of the boat and hide. He's like, but part of me came out there to see this, so I'm gonna see it. And he like, you know, and I think that sums it up pretty well. It's like, you know, if we're really gonna do this, it's like we have a responsibility in a way to our subjects to actually stay there and film, you know, to an extent. You know, you obviously, you're not gonna like commit suicide, you know, and like jump in front of a bullet because you have, but you do have a responsibility to bear witness to these things, because these people can't escape it.
Mm-hmm. To document it.
Yeah.
Which leads us back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, and that is just the truth of a scene, and keeping that, you know, within the framework of the documentary and not skewing it. I mean, I figure if that was something you wanted, you'd be in reality TV, and you'd be able to script it and make it. I mean, there is some, you know, there's a 3-act structure, shorts to documentaries, but how are you staying and creating a story, but also keeping it true? That's what I mean to say.
I think we talk a lot about our responsibility to our subjects, and I think that is a very solemn and heavy responsibility. But you also have a responsibility to a couple other things, you know, the truth, and also your audience. And, you know, while we are filming people in Cambodia, our audience primarily is going to be a Western audience. So the truth then that we also have responsibility to is kind of influenced a little bit of both. You know, we want to definitely, you know, make sure we portray our characters in a fair way, in a truthful way, and like, you know, share their truth. But we also, you know, are making a product for people in primarily North America, but also, you know, potentially Europe and some other places. So you also kind of have to focus a bit on what's interesting to them, because then otherwise your film will never get seen. And that's the sort of double-edged sword, is like you're still making entertainment that needs to be sold. So you have to kind of include certain elements that maybe your subject wouldn't, because you know, they think like, no, like this is actually more important, but maybe that thing, even though it is more important, if you just focused on that, the movie no one would watch the movie. So you're constantly balancing creating an engaging, interesting project with telling the truth, with what your subjects want, how they want to be portrayed, and what they want to show on camera. And it's a very tricky balance.
Yeah.
No,
I mean, that sums it up. It's true.
You talked about the translation process for the film. So I'm assuming that you have translators that are there in Cambodia helping you work with some of the people you're interviewing. But also, once the film is finished, what's the translation process like? What are you dealing with subtitles and things like that?
Well, usually, yeah, when you're on the field, you have field translators. Sometimes we rely on our characters or subjects to help us translate, especially if we don't have that much money. And then afterwards, in order to edit the footage, really, we need to get translations done. Usually, like if you have all the money in the world, you can send it off, the audio file off to a company, and they'll translate it and transcribe it for you with time code and everything. And so lately we've just been relying on a lot of friends in Cambodia and here who speak Cambodian, and to help us a little bit along the way. But we do need help with translations. I mean, that's indispensable to editing. We can't really edit unless we have the translations. And then sometimes we'll also have someone sit in with us to help us go through the footage and to make sure that the translations are accurate with how it's edited and everything like that. And then there's also the subtitling. So then with the transcripts in tow, then you subtitle the footage that you actually edit in usually, and then you run that by your interpreters or translators as well after that to make sure that it's accurate, that the translations and the subtitles are accurate with what's being heard.
Yeah, and the reason that in the Kickstarter that we asked, we specifically cited paying for translations is that, we do have people helping us, and they're really smart people, but, the quality of your translations is crucial. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times when you're, volunteers, if you're not paying people, they're not able to work on it as much or as quickly as you need. You're also maybe not getting professionals who are really understand both languages very well, but also because translation, which is a whole conversation to itself, there's a lot of the translator's own interpretation going on. And so you want someone who's really experienced, if you can get them to do it. And those people, as they should get, deserve to get paid and get paid well. So we have a lot more translations we haven't been able to do yet. Also, I would like to say that working in Cambodia in particular, as it is probably the case in other countries, but the languages are so different. It's not as simple as it is in some other languages where it's just a different word for the kind of the same thing. A lot of their words for things, particularly newer things, are a bunch of words stuck together. Like, I think they were telling me that a videographer, or like my job would be like person who shoots picture, or it's like this whole long description basically. And but in other ways, it's a very simple language that they don't have a lot of similar terms or ideas in the same way, like it's spelled out linguistically. And so it is very tricky, and that's something that we want to spend some time making sure we get right. Yeah. Luckily, our two main characters are English-speaking native people. One's from Australia, one's from England. So a lot of the film is in English, which in the documentary world, there's a lot of conversation around filming movies in Cambodia, but having these like Western main characters. And but I think the plus side of it is it makes your film a little bit more accessible and a little bit more commercial to our primary audience, which would be like North American or so there's some trade-offs to that. but we do have some crucial scenes that need to be translated. But the interesting thing of that is that we're gonna then probably have to go back and, if we want to show it in Cambodia, translate the English into Khmer. And luckily that step will happen after we sell the movie. So
Lots of translations.
lots of translations.
How happy are you that you've approached this film from having others under your belt? Because you're looking at it from now a new, not just about the story, which I know is what has attracted you, or the issue of the sea life, but also you're talking about, audience engagement, things like that, that most people, that the first time they make a documentary, they're not even thinking about that. So
Yeah, it's indispensable. I mean, and we're constantly learning things along the way. I mean, in the over a year, Christopher and I have been working together over a year now, and I mean, if you asked us back then if we would be the filmmakers that we are today, like, we would have never been able to predict that. And we've learned a lot on this project alone, and then on the other projects that we're doing simultaneously with this project, and then so much from the past as well. It's just, it really, adds, it's a snowball effect, and it's indispensable. And also just to keep learning and to keep growing and to keep pushing ourselves as filmmakers it's very important, because we have to stay engaged.
Definitely. I mean, we talked about Tiny at the beginning of this, and this film couldn't be more different than Tiny. And, this is my first time filming overseas, or, doing my own project overseas. So that's definitely been a learning experience for me too. And I'd never been to Asia or even Cambodia before. And when we first went, Stephanie's like, showing me the ropes, and I mean, like, very basic things. Like, this is a tuk-tuk, and this is how you take a tuk-tuk. So I'm grateful for her for that. But yeah, there's a lot of firsts and learning that's been happening on this film too. And it's been great. But I do think, having that baseline of experience without having done that, if this was my first film, I mean, it would have been so much harder, just because it's so hard to work in foreign countries. And it's also, really more intimidating, mentally challenging to do that, because you're so far from all of your resources and your home base. You're uncomfortable a lot of times, and you're out in the field, and you're filming knife fights, and it just, yeah, you kind of have to, like, have a level head, and things need to be sort of automatic and intuitive. You can't be, like, figuring out how to use your camera in that moment. You just have to know, like, exposure, turn this and that, and have all of the right things on hand, and anticipating what you're going to need, and all of that comes from the experience.
That's a good point. The intuition and the anticipation, it only comes from experience. You could go to film school and you could learn how to use the camera and how to edit and all this stuff, but it's only when you're actually, like, on the field, like, shooting verite and observational with characters, that you really know, like, this is what you should be getting, and this is what's going to be indispensable.
Just a few days ago, Christopher, you had a piece published on nofilmschool.com, which was 10 production-saving tips for filming in remote locations. And it was excellent advice, and I was just wondering if we could talk about a few of them, maybe some of which you consider the most important.
I think the most important thing, hands down, is just the need to do your homework and prepare before your trip, because that information that you get from that process informs all of the decisions you're going to have to make throughout the whole production, in terms of, what's the climate like, what's your resources there, where are the emergency facilities, like, what's the culture like, all of those things, they inform everything from what kind of equipment you bring to, what kind of clothing you bring, like, all that stuff, but also logistics in terms of transportation and, yeah, I think it just really informs it all. I think another one might be just the safety issues, really, in terms of preparing with getting the right insurance in place, just in case, unforeseen circumstances, and also, what you need to bring in terms of taking care of your well-being, and what information you need in terms of being evacuated or something like that, should something go wrong. So, yeah, I think those are probably the two obviously big ones. And then there's a lot of, sort of follow-on pieces of advice just about gear and what to consider with that.
I thought was interesting was you said just don't have your gear in bags that scream, "Hey, I'm a filmmaker
Right.
and this is expensive gear." And maybe can you talk about some ways to kind of downplay the fact that you are wearing essentially thousands of dollars worth of gear on you?
Right. Yeah. That's a really tricky one because you at times you just can't hide it, but definitely I opt not to take Pelican cases or any sort of hard case. And for carry-ons, I carry on my camera always, and I'll just have like a soft backpack camera bag. And I think that's actually just way more practical than Pelican case anyways. But it also tends to look just like a big backpack, which is nice. And then for checked stuff, I just opt for really large rolly luggage, like you would normally just see with the Traveler. And I just get one that's long enough to fit my tripod in. And I, make it all fit into those basically. And will pack in clothes and stuff around the gear to help pad it and everything. And then I'll use a TSA approved lock to lock it up, which, when you get to developing countries, and I don't really know how risky this is, but I've heard stories of, people who work at the airlines stealing things out of bags, or not even them, just like, hotels or anywhere else. It is a thing that can happen. And so I think having a little bit of security with the lock, at the very least, gives you peace of mind. So
That's great advice. And also, too, when you mentioned TSA, so 2017, getting through the checkpoint is probably more and more stringent than ever before. What are some tips on protecting what's going through, and what if your bag is opened up? Mine's been opened up and I didn't have any gear in it,
Yeah.
but so there's...
it's all, if you have gear, they always are going to open your bag. I mean, particularly, I've noticed tripod bags get open every single time that I've experienced at any rate. And I traveled a lot with my gear over the years, not just for this project, but for another film I'm working on. And also back in the tiny days, I was sort of splitting my time between New York and Colorado. And there was a while there I brought literally everything I used to make movies with me everywhere I went, including my computer and hard drives and like to edit on. And so I have a fair amount of experience doing that. And my experience is they always check your bags. I think the only thing I've ever really run into was I've had some Allen keys, and I guess the largest size of that Allen key set wasn't approved to be carried on, so they confiscated that one. But I think I think the tools, your carry-on is the thing that you have to worry about, and so having these sort of sharp objects or tools, you might as well just put those in your checked luggage, and then you won't risk having them confiscated.
Right. And what about a look like you belong? I mean, that probably varies, and I'm not even sure if I'm paraphrasing for one of the tips that you mentioned, but, fitting into the culture of the place, it's kind of like if you're somewhere in Venice Beach and you're filming, you want to maybe look the part, like you're going to the beach, not in full, regalia. So
yeah. I think, it's sort of impossible, particularly in Cambodia, to really look like you belong, but looking like you aren't fresh off the boat. Like that you are aware of your surroundings at all times, and that you basically want to make yourself look like not an easy target. And rather than being a tourist who doesn't necessarily know any better, but if it looks like you are knowledgeable about how things work in the country and you're aware, and that's when I think people are just going to say, that guy's just a little too difficult, or that girl, and instead go after the tourist. Not that they should go after. We don't want that, but
Right. Well, you can always tell, even in LA, and there's so many people, who's a tourist and who's not, by how they're kind of looking around in awe, like we're animals in a zoo sort of thing. But you also talked about maybe riding in taxis and where to put your bags.
Right. Definitely. Yeah. I think taking it's more expensive. Everything you do as a filmmaker in foreign countries is going to be more expensive because you have considerations that you don't when you're just traveling, which is mostly way more luggage and more expensive gear. So I usually end up taking single taxis, which in Cambodia is pretty uncommon and reserved for people who have a lot of money. Normally they share taxis, or they take tuk-tuks, or they ride on the back of motorcycles. And I've done all of those things in Cambodia. But what I normally do is when I arrive with all of my gear and bags, I take a taxi to the hotel where I drop it off, and if I don't need it, then I'll tuk-tuk or ride a motorcycle around town. But when I'm going out on a shoot, I bring only what I need for that shoot. And because this is a verite shoot, oftentimes I don't always bring my my tripod with me, because I do a lot mostly handheld stuff. So in that case, I can just bring my backpack and get everything in there that I need for the day. And a lot of my additional gear is more for interviews and things like that, like lighting or cables, or hard drives that I can offload to later, things like that I don't need to shoot. And then when I ride in tuk-tuks with my gear or bags, I make sure to keep them in the middle of the tuk-tuk, because people will ride up next to them, and they'll have one person on the back of a motorcycle who will reach over and grab your bag and then ride away, and your tuk-tuk's never going to catch a motorcycle. So, you just want to kind of be aware that that's a possibility. Keep your hand on your bag, and just keep your eye out for suspicious motorcycles who might be trying to grab your bags.
Well, last but not least, what about making polite conversation and someone asks, "Hey, what are you doing here? What are you up to?" Do you disclose, "Oh, I'm a documentary filmmaker," or you just say, "I'm traveling and want to try out my new camera"?
I think that really depends on who's asking. Little kids, particularly in these developing countries, just like love seeing, not only Westerners, but just like when you have a camera, they know about TV and cameras and what that means, and so they're like, get really excited and they want to come over and see what you're doing. And I love to show it to them, and like you let them like play with it sometimes if I have time. If it's somebody who looks like they're in a place of authority, I do tend to downplay it a little bit, only because you don't want to call too much attention to yourself. You never know who is legitimate, who's not, who, just because you can't help but not know those things in a country you're not familiar with. And just like you wouldn't do that here, if you didn't know why somebody was asking you questions in a part of town you're not normally in, you probably, you try to keep it kind of close to your chest what you're doing. But, I just say like, "Oh, I'm filming," actually, I don't actually say what the project is. I say what I'm filming. So somebody like, "Oh, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm filming this fisherman," or whatever.
That's great, right?
Yeah, because you're answering the question, but it's not giving away too much.
At the end of the day, when Currency is finished and out there, what type of impact do you want it to have? What do you want it to do?
So after Tiny came out, it had a much bigger impact than we kind of ever imagined it would. And I think for documentary filmmakers, that's sort of the bug you catch more than the fame, and definitely not the money. But the reason you want to do it is because you want to have a positive impact on the world. And I think with Currency, I don't think it's going to have a very big impact in a very tangible sense in the U.S. or Western countries. I think it could in Cambodia in terms of really showing like what's going on there, and sort of the corruption angle, and like might put an end to these rule violators kind of getting away with it, and it might really help that situation if it's seen widely there. In the States, what I hope happens is that people are more aware of these situations and sort of our role in them, because one of the big things that contributes to this problem is the influx of money from NGOs down there, which is good in some respects and is well-meaning, but some of what's missing with that is understanding what's happening on the ground. So the money is either misdirected, or is funneled into some of these corrupt people's pockets. Usually the people, the NGOs are unaware it's even happening. And so I think what I'm trying to say is like, not that I'm hoping that, NGO investment in Cambodia stops, but just that it's framed around what's really happening and not what our idea of what's happening is going on down there. And I think that this film can, to a lot of people who might be donors to those organizations, could expose kind of like a more honest portrayal of the intricacies of all the problems and how the gray area, because, going into this project, I always thought, oh, corruption is always bad. You know, like and my vision of it is with these people who are sitting back and like, getting, obviously violating laws and getting money, and enriching themselves and fight, meanwhile, all these other people are suffering. But really in Cambodia, corruption sometimes just looks like an informal economy, and realizing that it's really a whole like spectrum of grayness. Some of it is black and white, but a lot of it is like, well, is that really wrong? Like, there's a lot of policemen who would be considered corrupt in the US, which is, who are like stopping people for not wearing helmets on their motorcycles, asking for a $5 fine, and then, just putting it in their pocket. But what we don't realize is that those policemen are hired a lot of times, don't make very much money, but they're kind of told that this is how you augment your salary. And the question is like, we would say, oh, well, that's still wrong. But really at the end of the day, the only difference between the way we do it here is here, they take that money, they gave it to the government who gives it back to them in a paycheck. Whereas there, they just get it and it's their paycheck, but it's still enforcing the law, right? So, once you start kind of seeing how some of that stuff works, it's a little bit harder to fully be angry. And the more I'm like less convinced of my own certainty about right and wrong in some respects, but then there is very clear cases of corruption that is wrong there, and those are the ones that we really are targeting with our film, and I think that they can change. But I guess what I'm trying to say is like, it doesn't do any NGO any people here who want to do good in other countries any good to not have a full understanding of the complexity of the situation. Because it's so easy for us to oversimplify it by using our own Western lens and values and projecting that, rather than trying to understand what their lens and their values and the complicated nature of the issues that they're dealing with.